Greetings. Today's presentation is about resisting the noonday devil. It deals with sloth, acedia, anomie, and organizational leadership. Every professor has one or more of them in class. Students that are deeply gifted and talented but disengaged from the material and generally disruptive to the learning process. They have stellar skills, but because of a poor attitude often functions as low performers. When these students graduate and enter the organizational world, they often become what Mark Murphy, CEO of Leadership IQ, identifies as talented terrors. Murphy describes these individuals as having the skills, but not the willingness to contribute to the goals of the organization, and as being narcissistic, dramatic, whining, and complaining. These talented terrors are not only disruptive to the organizational goals of the organization, but sometimes will drive away high-performing employees that are not willing to deal with the politics of sloth. Surprisingly, the description of organizational laziness is not new. Christian theologians and philosophers in history named this toxic spiritual condition acedia, or the sin of not caring. This presentation seeks to define the ancient Christian concept of acedia, illustrate the link between acedia and sloth, explore what these sins look like within an organizational context, and finally probe possible solutions to organizational acedia or sloth. Let me start with the ancient sin of acedia. The concept of acedia as moral sloth was first described by the 4th century Christian monastic leader Evagrius Ponticus. He's sometimes called Evagrius the Solitary. Evagrius described this condition as one of organizational ennui, daily boredom, spiritual torpor, or work apathy, all terms that could be employed to describe organizational laziness or sloth. But acedia, at least in early Christian theology, is seen as more than mere laziness or the effects of some form of clinical depression. Evagrius' most erudite description of acedia occurs in his book, The Practicals and Chapters on Prayer, here chapter 12, where he writes, quotation, "The demon of acedia, also called the noonday demon, is the one that causes the most serious trouble of all. He presses his attack upon the monk about the 4th hour and besieges the soul until the 9th hour. Firstly, he makes it seem that the sun barely moves, if at all, and the day is 50 hours long. He constrains the monk to look constantly out of the windows, to walk outside the cell, to gaze carefully at the sun to determine how far it stands from the 9th hour, to look now this way and now that way to see if perhaps one of the brethren appears from his cell." End quotation. Evagrius' description of acedia as the noonday demon, of course he's referring to Psalms 90 verse 6 here, and it's the sin that causes the most serious trouble, were because it was thought that this spiritual condition keeps the sufferer from the will to fight any of the other demons or vices that may tempt in the pursuit of God. Christopher Eust echoes Evagrius' understanding of acedia as prime in the list of cardinal sins when he writes, quotation, "So then, if it is a question of the monastic life in general, acedia is not just one temptation among many. It is quite simply the temptation. The calling into question of one's entire existence, the major identity crisis in which the very foundations of everything are severely shaken." Acedia is used by Evagrius and other early Christian theologians to refer to a large cluster of symptoms of spiritual dysfunction. The paralyzing symptoms of acedia, as described by the early Christian theologians, can be divided into two basic categories, somatic and psychological. The bodily symptoms here, somatic of acedia, are described as firstly, sleepiness by Evagrius, general sickness or debility by one of the church mothers, actual fact, a desert mother here, Amma Theodora, or thirdly, as pain or fever. The described somatic symptoms of acedia are debilitating ones that keep the sufferer from doing the right things, as it is described in the 17th century words of Joseph Haziah. He writes, start quotation, "Once this demon of acedia took hold of my tongue and prevented me from performing the office because he had placed a heavy weight on my head and a burdensome disease on all my limbs." End quotation. Some of the psychological symptoms of acedia are listed as, number 1, organizational dissatisfaction. Secondly, tedium or boredom. Thirdly, inappropriate thoughts. And lastly, as general laziness. These supported psychological symptoms all share one outcome, that of instability. It is interesting to note that the famous rule of Benedict starts with a description of this danger of instability and seeks to address this in the well-known exploration of Benedict's spirituality of ora et labora, or prayer and work. In Benedictine spirituality, this temptation of moving from place to place is countered with the vow of stability, as illustrated in a saying attributed to the great Desert Father Saint Anthony of the Tombs in the rule when it's written, and this is attributed to Anthony. Start quotation. Do what I tell you, which is this: where you go, keep God in mind. Whatever you do, follow the example of Holy Scripture. Wherever you are, stay there and do not move away in a hurry. If you keep these guidelines, you will be saved. End quotation. For Evagrius, acedia is the ground condition for which 7 other sins sprang. In order, here are the 7 sins according to Evagrius: gluttony, lust, avarice, dejection, anger, vainglory, and pride. Later, John Cassian, coming after Evagrius, of course this is 4th century, early 5th century, simplifies and refines the list as follows. Now the list reads: gluttony, fornication, covetousness, anger, dejection, acedia, vainglory, and pride. The great Pope Gregory the Great, of course, in his commentary on the book of Job, coming later here in the 6th and 7th century, removes acedia from his list of 7 cardinal sins, perhaps because of the earlier thought that all the sins sprang from acedia. Gregory's list reports 7 sins, each leading and giving birth to the next. Here the list reports to be vainglory, envy, anger, dejection, covetousness, gluttony, and fornication. The list would go through several more permutations until a kind of codification occurs in the list of the very famous Dante's Inferno and Purgatorio. In this list, books, of course, the list now seems to substitute sloth for dejection and acedia. Dante's list reads: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. The interchange of terms between acedia, sloth, and dejection indicates something of the complex understanding of this condition in early and medieval Christianity. The 13th century Franciscan author David of Augsburg summarizes this compound understanding when he lists 3 types of acedia. Firstly, there's melancholic acedia. Secondly, acedia as idleness, negligence, or sloth. And lastly, acedia as boredom. The root word for acedia in the Greek includes one that is without care, one that is in despair, and lastly, the condition of weary apathy. It is important to note here that acedia is more than just laziness or idleness. It is the inability to care. Well, what does acedia look like in an organizational context? Leaders and followers suffering from this kind of apathy know what the right thing is to do, but they simply do not care enough to be engaged with the actual work and therefore the goals and objectives of the organization. In time, this kind of acedia produces an organizational death spiral that ends in severe depression. The British playwright and poet Dorothy Sayers describes such an individual as one who believes in nothing, cares for nothing, seeks to know nothing, interferes with nothing, enjoys nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing, and remains alive because there's nothing for which it will die. In the face of such a grim picture, how can organizational leaders identify and remedy this absence of care in their followers? The first step might be to understand the different kinds of acedia in organizations. In 1893, the eminent sociologist Emile Durkheim introduced the concept of anomie. Durkheim described anomie as a state of psychological normlessness, a condition that he described in which norms have been erased. Acedia in the workplace, also described as moral sloth by Kathleen Norris, not only demoralizes employees, but leave them in a state of painful inability to participate in the ordinary operation and mission of the organization. Applied to organizational context, anomie and acedia often work together to erode the very fabric of morality and work ethic of workers. Robert Merton, extending the insights of Durkheim, proposed 4 kinds of deviant adaptations to the existence of normlessness in organizations. Firstly, innovation. Secondly, ritualism. Thirdly, retreatism. And lastly, rebellion. Andrew Chrysalip, exploring the organizational interaction between acedia and anomie, takes these 4 descriptions further and proposes that these 4 deviant adaptations of normlessness have 4 different effects on erosion of norms in the individual worker, whether that be a leader or a follower in an organization. Building on the work of Evagrius Ponticus, Emil Durkheim, and Andrew Chryslip, organizational leaders can identify 4 different kinds of workers that suffer from organizational acedia. Firstly, critics. Secondly, ritualists. Thirdly, hermits. And fourthly and lastly, rebels. Let me describe each of these a little bit better. Let's start with critics. Here the worker accepts the goals and objectives of the organization, but rejects the institutionalized means of reaching those goals. The worker's personal acedia keeps the worker from proposing any real innovations. This kind of worker disrupts the operations of the organization with constant criticism without ever providing any concrete solutions to the problems observed. In an organizational context, these kinds of critics are known for much talk and little to no action. Let's describe the ritualists. Here the worker rejects or despairs of achieving the goals and objectives of the organization, but continues to enact the institutionalized means or practices as a mindless ritual. The worker's heart is not in these means or practices, and thus fails to fulfill these duties in an effective manner that inspires others to do the same.